The sound of the shot rang out, sharp and final, like a death sentence. Leo's eyes locked onto the horror unfolding before him as Maria's body jerked, the life draining from her in an instant. A second shot echoed in the night, and she crumpled to the ground, a lifeless heap, blood spreading across the cold asphalt like a warning. He ran toward her, his heart pounding, desperate, but it was too late. He reached her side just as the last breath escaped her lips, a silent plea for mercy he could never answer. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows that seemed to mock him in his helplessness. His hands trembled as he touched her face, still warm but slipping away with every second. But the pain was nothing compared to the fury burning inside him. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a random act of violence. He knew who had done this, the people who swore to uphold the law, the ones who wore badges and hid behind lies. Corrupt cops had killed his wife, and they'd made a grave mistake. As the weight of her loss crushed him, one thought blazed through his mind: they will pay. Leo swore to make them regret ever crossing him. The world had taken everything from him, but he would take back justice on his terms, and no one, not even the law, would stop him. The days that followed Maria's death were nothing but a blur of empty motion. But before that, before the nightmare began, life had been simple. A quiet, predictable rhythm of love and routine, with moments of happiness that felt so ordinary, so secure, it was hard to imagine how fleeting they truly were. Leo had never wanted anything grand. He was a man of simplicity, someone who found peace in the small things. Mornings began with the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen, its rich aroma filling the house as he roused from sleep. Maria would always beat him to it, standing by the stove with a gentle smile, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing the faded robe she had worn since their first year together. She was the warmth of their home, the heart of their shared life. Leo often wondered how he'd gotten so lucky to be married to someone like her, so full of grace and compassion. Their conversations each morning were nothing extraordinary. They'd chat about the day ahead, the weather, mundane things that people often took for granted. Got a long day ahead, she'd ask him with a teasing smile as he sipped his coffee. Not too bad, he'd reply, a chuckle escaping him. Just the usual, more paperwork than I cared to look at. He was a detective, nothing glamorous, just a man who'd worked his way up through the ranks. But Maria never made him feel like his job was anything less than important. She always told him she admired his commitment, his unwavering sense of justice. After breakfast, their son Lucas would bounce into the kitchen, his small feet slapping against the floor in a rhythmic, excited pattern. He was 4 years old, with bright eyes and a never-ending curiosity about the world around him. Maria would scoop him up in her arms, lifting him as he giggled and kicked his legs in the air. Leo would watch them, a smile tugging at his lips. Their little family was his anchor, his purpose. Ready for another adventure? Maria would ask Lucas as she dressed him for daycare. Yup, he'd answer with a grin, pulling on his little sneakers with a sense of pride, despite the fact that they were far too big for him. But to Lucas, they were the biggest shoes in the world. Leo would laugh as he adjusted his tie, heading out to the car with them. They'd make their way to daycare, the same route they took every day. The same easy conversation between him and Maria, the kind of routine that felt as though it would never change. And it didn't need to. It was the kind of life Leo had always wanted. Steady, secure, full of love. After dropping Lucas off at daycare, Leo would head to the precinct, where his colleagues greeted him with knowing nods and easy banter. Work wasn't always glamorous. There were routine investigations, cases that seemed unsolvable, hours spent on paperwork, but he loved it. It was his calling, the one thing that made him feel like he was contributing to something bigger than himself. He'd often come home tired, his back aching from long hours at his desk, but the moment he walked through the door and saw Maria's face, or Lucas running toward him with open arms, all the exhaustion seemed to vanish. In the evenings, they'd sit down together as a family. Maria would make dinner, her cooking always delicious, despite the mess she'd make in the kitchen, and they'd share a meal at their small but cozy dining table. Conversations would flow, easily talk of Lucas's day at daycare, updates on their friends, discussions about the little things that mattered. They'd laugh together, watch their favorite TV shows, or simply talk about their hopes and dreams for the future. It was a life built on comfort, trust, and love. On weekends, they'd go on little adventures, a trip to the zoo, a visit to the park, or even just a walk around the neighborhood. Leo loved those moments when it was just the three of them, enjoying each other's company without any distractions or interruptions. They were happy, he was happy. The world outside their bubble of contentment seemed so distant, so irrelevant. It was easy to believe that nothing could shatter this happiness. It was easy to think that they were untouchable, that their simple life could withstand anything. There was no sign that anything could go wrong. No warning that the world was about to turn upside down. One of the last things Maria said to him that morning before he left for work was, "I love you, Leo, don't forget that. No matter what happens today." It had seemed so trivial at the time, just one of those casual exchanges between a couple who had been together for so long, but now, as Leo sat by her grave, those words echoed in his mind. He hadn't known it then, but those words were a farewell, a final reminder of the life they had before everything came crashing down. At the time, he couldn't have known that the world he had built with Maria and Lucas would be shattered beyond recognition. He couldn't have known that his peaceful, mundane existence would be turned upside down by an act of brutal violence by the very people he trusted to uphold the law. How could he have known that in just a few short hours, the woman he loved would be gone, ripped away from him without warning? But that was the cruelest thing about it all. In the span of a single day, everything he had known was destroyed. The steady rhythm of their lives, the security they had taken for granted, was gone. And in its place was nothing but the hollow ache of loss and a burning desire for revenge. Leo could still hear Lucas's laughter in his mind, still see Maria's smile, still feel the warmth of their home. It was a life he could never go back to, a world that no longer existed. And in the wake of the tragedy, Leo found himself standing on the precipice, staring into the abyss of his own grief and anger, wondering if he would ever find a way back from the darkness. But that was the thing about tragedy, it never gives you a choice. It doesn't ask you whether you're ready. It simply takes and leaves you to pick up the pieces, whether you want to or not. And Leo knew, deep in his soul, that he would never be the same again. The days before Maria's death were unsettling in ways Leo couldn't quite grasp at the time. Life had begun to feel off, though he couldn't put his finger on why. There were no obvious threats, no immediate dangers, at least, not on the surface. But something was wrong. Something lingered just beneath the surface, like a storm cloud, gathering on the horizon, its shadows creeping closer with each passing day. It started with the calls. First it was just a few hang-ups, strange numbers flashing on his phone screen, each call ending the moment he answered. He had brushed it off, assuming it was a wrong number or telemarketers. Every cop knew how annoying the unsolicited calls could be, but soon, the calls became more frequent, and the silence on the other end became more persistent. Leo had mentioned it to Maria one evening as they sat at the dinner table, Lucas playing with his toys at their feet. "Someone keeps calling me, no one says anything, it's just ... dead air." Maria had frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. "That's strange. Maybe you should block the number or report it." But Leo hadn't taken it seriously. It felt too insignificant to matter, too minor a nuisance to be worried about. He didn't even recognize the area code. His work with the department had never led to anything so dangerous. After all, there were no threats on his life that he knew of, no enemies he could think of, just the occasional annoyance from people who didn't know when to let go of a grudge. Then there were the whispers at the precinct, just little things, shift in the air, a slight change in tone when he walked past certain colleagues. At first he dismissed it as paranoia. Cops weren't immune to gossip, and his reputation had always been solid. But the tension was palpable, like something was waiting to break. Leo could feel it in the subtle way people avoided eye contact, the strained smiles, the hushed conversations that stopped the moment he walked into the room. One evening, as he stood by his car in the precinct parking lot, one of his colleagues, Detective Anderson, walked past him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, Leo," he said, voice low, almost too low. "You need to watch your back. Not everyone in this city is as loyal as they seem." It was an offhand remark, thrown out with a half smile, but Leo could see the unease in Anderson's eyes. He brushed it off, thinking the older detective was just being paranoid. He had been through his fair share of rough cases, and it wasn't uncommon for people to feel the weight of the job in ways they couldn't express. But those small moments began to add up. The calls, the whispers, the sideways glances. Something felt off. Still, Leo couldn't put his finger on it. It wasn't until the day before Maria died that the unease turned into something much darker. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning, just like any other. He kissed Maria goodbye, promised he'd be home early, and watched Lucas give him his usual wave from the front porch as he pulled out of the driveway. The world outside seemed unchanged, the sun shining bright, the air crisp with the first bite of fall. But as Leo pulled into the precinct parking lot, something caught his eye. A car parked too close to the entrance, its windows tinted so dark that he couldn't make out the driver's face. It seemed out of place, almost deliberate, as though it had been waiting for him. Leo shrugged it off at first. He had seen cars parked in strange places before, but as he walked past, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The driver didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him, just sat there, perfectly still. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something being wrong. But he had a job to do. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. Still, he kept his eyes open, his mind sharp. The whole day passed in a blur of routine work, but the sensation of unease never left him. And as the day wore on, the atmosphere in the precinct seemed to grow heavier, thicker, suffocating. By the time he was heading home that evening, Leo had pushed the unsettling thoughts aside. He was tired, distracted by the weight of the work on his shoulders, and eager to get back to his family. He hadn't heard from Maria all day, but that wasn't unusual. She was busy with her own work, or maybe playing with Lucas. Still, as he drove, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. Something felt off. When he finally pulled into the driveway and saw Maria's car still parked in the same spot, it only deepened the unease. She should have been home by now. He tried calling her, but the call went straight to voicemail. He shrugged it off. She'd probably just been caught up with something. Maybe she went out with friends or had to run an errand. It wasn't like her to not return a call, but there was no reason to jump to conclusions. As he entered the house, a cold silence greeted him. He called out her name, but there was no answer. He checked the kitchen, the living room, and even Lucas's room. Still, nothing. His heart rate quickened, and a sinking feeling spread in his chest. That's when he saw Ito's note on the kitchen counter. Maria's handwriting, neat and precise as always, "Went out for a walk, love you." He breathed a sigh of relief, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at him, but then he heard the sound, a distant, muffled noise that made his blood run cold. It came from outside, from the direction of the alley behind their house. His instincts kicked in, and his hand instinctively reached for the gun at his waist. He moved quickly toward the door, the sound growing louder with every step, his heart pounding in his ears. As soon as he stepped outside, he saw them, two figures, dressed in black, moving quickly, deliberately, down the alley. They didn't see him at first, and he froze, watching them through the kitchen window. One of them was carrying something bulky, wrapped in cloth, but Leo's mind couldn't make sense of it. His first instinct was to run after them, to confront them, but something stopped him, an odd sense of danger, of knowing that this wasn't something he could handle alone. He reached for his phone, his hand shaking as he dialed Maria, but there was no answer. The cold, gnawing sensation in his gut exploded into a full-blown panic. He stepped into the yard, his breath shallow, eyes scanning the alley for any sign of Maria. He called out again, nothing. Then, just as quickly as the figures had appeared, they vanished into the shadows, disappearing like ghosts. Leo didn't know it yet, but that was the moment his life began to unravel. Every moment of calm, every ounce of normalcy that he had come to rely on had already been chipped away, piece by piece, and now the world was breaking open. Something was happening, something he couldn't understand, but that he knew would change everything. Later that night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything began to settle in. The unsettling calls, the strange behavior of his colleagues, the car parked outside the precinct, the men in the alley, the warnings he hadn't understood before. They all led him to one inescapable conclusion. He wasn't just a detective anymore, he was a target, and someone was closing in on him and his family. Before the night was over, Leo would be forced to face the truth. His life was no longer his own, and the tragedy he had been blind to was already set in motion. Leo sat in the dark, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The room was still, suffocating in its silence, and yet every breath he took felt like a struggle. His mind was a battlefield of emotions, grief, guilt, rage, each fighting for dominance. The pain of Maria's death, so fresh and raw, had carved an irreparable wound deep inside him, and every time he tried to focus, to think clearly, that wound opened wider, threatening to swallow him whole. He hadn't moved from his spot by the window for hours. The soft glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the blinds, casting jagged shadows across the floor. His hands were trembling, his jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. His mind kept replaying the events of that night. Away Maria had looked lying there in the alley, her face so pale, so empty. Her lifeless body seemed to mock him, accusing him of failure. He had promised her he would protect her, and now she was gone. His promises, his duty as a husband, had failed. Worse than the guilt was the crushing sense of helplessness. He couldn't stop the overwhelming feelings of powerlessness from surging over him. There had been nothing he could do. He had watched it all unfold from a distance, helpless, unable to reach her in time. His instincts had screamed at him to do something, anything, but by the time he'd realized what was happening, it was already too late. That night, Leo didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maria's face, the blood, the emptiness in her eyes, the way she had looked at him for the last time, silently begging him to save her. And in those moments, he had felt his own strength faltering. He was supposed to be strong, he was supposed to be her protector, her shield, but instead, he had failed her. In the hours before dawn, Leo dragged himself out of bed, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. He moved through the house like a ghost, each step a reminder of what he had lost. Maria's presence was everywhere. Her laughter echoed in the empty spaces. Her scent lingered in the rooms they had shared, in the clothes she had worn. It all felt so surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He walked into Lucas's room, trying to steady himself. His son, his precious boy, lay there asleep, blissfully unaware of the shattered world that had suddenly become their reality. Leo stood in the doorway, staring at him, his chest tightening with grief. The sight of his son, so innocent and unaware of the nightmare that had taken his mother, only deepened the pit of despair that consumed him. Leo's thoughts spiraled in that moment. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to protect Lucas from the same fate? What could he say to him when he grew old enough to ask where his mother had gone? How could Leo look him in the eyes and explain the darkness that had come into their lives? He had nothing to offer Lucas, no sense of safety. No promise that the world they had known could ever return. The anger surged again, filling the emptiness with a consuming fire. His thoughts twisted into something darker. He needed answers. He needed to know who had done this to Maria. He needed them to feel the pain, the loss, the emptiness he felt every moment of his waking life. He needed justice. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how powerless he was. The same people who had taken her from him, the corrupt cops, the ones in power, were the ones who had control over everything. They held all the cards, and Leo was left with nothing but his grief, his rage, and a thirst for vengeance that threatened to drown him. The grief was always there, hovering just beneath the surface. It was like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, stealing his breath and suffocating him. Every time he thought he could push through it, every time he tried to move on, it crept up on him, relentless, suffocating. The emptiness Maria had left behind was too vast, too deep to escape, but the rage that was something different. It burned inside him like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. It was a force that could drive him forward when everything else felt like it was falling apart. It gave him focus, gave him something to hold on to when his entire world had been torn to pieces. The need for vengeance was like a drug. Every time he thought about Maria's killers, every time he pictured them walking free while she lay in the ground, it spurred him on, pushed him toward a reckoning he wasn't sure he could survive. Leo knew what he had to do. He knew he couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He had to make them pay. He had to make them feel the same helplessness he felt, the same raw pain that gnawed at his insides every second of every day. But as the days passed and the shock began to fade, Leo realized just how broken he truly was. He was unraveling. He could feel himself slipping, his sense of self fraying at the edges. There were moments when he'd wake up, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, unable to remember if the nightmare he had just experienced was real or just another vision of Maria's death haunting him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the fact that the woman he had loved more than anything in the world was gone. He couldn't escape the crushing weight of guilt, the feeling that he should have done more, that he should have seen the signs, should have been there to stop it. There were moments when the desire for vengeance felt like his only anchor, the only thing keeping him from drowning. But in the stillness, in the quiet moments when his mind wandered, he was forced to confront something deeper, something that terrified him even more than the thought of facing the men who had killed his wife. His own mind. He found himself questioning everything: the man he had been, the life he had built, the purpose he had always thought he understood. What was the point of all of it? What was the point of justice if it didn't bring back the people you loved? What was the point of doing what was right if it only led to more pain, more destruction? The rage, the need for vengeance, it was all-consuming. But there were times, when the anger subsided for just a moment, that he felt it like a heavy hand pressing down on his chest, suffocating him from the inside. A gnawing emptiness, a profound loss. What if his quest for vengeance would only make him just like them? What if he became the very thing he despised, the cold, indifferent force that took Maria from him in the first place? Every step he took toward revenge, Every decision he made to pursue justice was fraught with doubt. His grief had cracked him wide open, and now the fragility he felt was as dangerous as the anger that burned within him. It made him unpredictable, unstable. But one thing became clear as the days wore on: he couldn't stop, he couldn't walk away from this. The need for revenge had taken root deep inside him, and it would not let go. It was as though the desire for justice had become an extension of his griefs, something that fed off the pain, something that kept him alive when everything else felt broken beyond repair. His vulnerability was a constant companion, now and ever-present weight that held him down, made him question everything. But in that vulnerability, in that brokenness, he found something else: the resolve to make them pay, to make them all feel what he felt, to make them understand the devastation they had caused. And so, despite the doubts, despite the fear that he might lose himself in the process, Leo pushed forward. Every thought, every step, was toward a singular goal: vengeance. And somewhere deep within the chaos of grief and guilt, Leo knew that he would not stop until those who had stolen his life, his love, his family, paid the ultimate price. Leo's thirst for vengeance had begun to take shape, but the path forward was not as clear as he had hoped. The faces of those responsible for Maria's death loomed in his mind, figures cloaked in the armor of law and authority. Corrupt cops who had killed his wife and left him broken in their wake. They were supposed to protect and serve, but Leo knew they were nothing more than predators, hidden beneath the guise of power and respectability. The first time Leo saw Detective Trent Walker up close was at the precinct. Walker was one of the so-called golden boys of the department, a seasoned detective with a reputation for cracking tough cases. He was the kind of cop who wore his badge like a crown, his cold, calculating demeanor making him both feared and admired by his peers. Leo had always known that Walker played by his own rules, bending the law whenever it suited him, but Maria's death had pulled back the curtain, revealing the full extent of his corruption. He was one of the men responsible for the quiet violence, the cover-ups, and the under-the-table dealings that had allowed the city to rot from the inside out. Walker stood in the center of a group of officers at the precinct, exchanging a few jokes with his colleagues, his sharp eyes scanning the room with an air of quiet confidence. There was no trace of regret in his eyes, no sign that he was haunted by his actions, no sense of guilt that would give him away. He had become a part of the system, and the system protected him. For him, Maria was just another casualty, another name on a growing list of people who had been swept away in the chaos of a broken, corrupted world. Leo watched him from across the room, his fists clenched at his sides. He had learned to hide his rage, to keep it buried beneath the surface, but it burned through him now like a wildfire, threatening to consume everything in its path. Walker was untouchable. He knew it. Everyone knew it. But Leo wasn't sure that would stop him. The second antagonist was Sergeant Olivia Harris, a woman whose name had always been whispered with a mix of fear and respect in the department. Harris was no stranger to moral ambiguity. She had a reputation for bending the law to get results, her actions justified by her own sense of righteousness. To the public, she was a pillar of strength, a cop who got things done, but behind closed doors, she had her own demons, personal and professional. She had always been a hard, pragmatic woman, one who had learned to sacrifice the little things for the greater good. Or so she told herself. Leo had crossed paths with Harris on more than one occasion, but their interactions had always been cordial, even respectful. She had been a senior officer when Leo first joined the force, and they had worked together on a few high-profile cases. Harris had always struck Leo as driven, intelligent, and practical. There had been moments when he had admired her, but those moments now seemed distant and naive. Her willingness to play within the broken system had led her to become one of its most effective enforcers, a woman who had learned how to manipulate the rules to her advantage, all while convincing herself that she was doing what was necessary to survive in a dangerous world. It wasn't until after Maria's death that Leo began to understand the full scope of Harris's involvement in the corruption that had ensnared the department. She was a key player in the web of deceit and manipulation that had allowed men like Walker to thrive, turning a blind eye to the suffering they caused as long as it served her agenda. The last figure in Leo's mind was Captain Richard Hill. Hill had been around the department for decades, a man whose reputation as a straight-laced, no-nonsense officer had earned him respect from both his peers and the public, but respect was often the mask for something darker. Hill had long been a fixture in the department, but the deeper Leo dug, the more he realized that Hill had buried his own demons behind a facade of discipline and professionalism. Hill had been in charge when Maria was murdered, and it was his word that carried the weight in the department's decisions. The public face of Hill was that of a man who believed in justice above all else. But there were whispers about the deals he had made with criminal organizations, the payouts he'd taken in exchange for keeping certain cases quiet. Hill was not immune to the corruption that ran through the veins of the force, and as Leo began to piece together the truth, he realized that Hill had made sacrifices, long ago sacrifices, that had turned him into something he now despised. He had made compromises that had ensured his success, but at a cost. Hill was no longer a man who fought for the law. He was a man who fought for his own survival. As Leo dug deeper into the lives of these people, his rage began to shift from a generalized hatred of the system to a more personal, focused fury. They were not just nameless, faceless antagonists. They were human, flawed, conflicted, and deeply entangled in a web of their own making. Walker, for all his cold indifference, wasn't immune to the dark undercurrents of his own mind. He had built a reputation on his ability to stay detached, to make hard decisions without looking back. But the cracks in his facade were starting to show. Leo had heard rumors, bits of conversation that hinted at the cracks in Walker's own world: alcoholism, an estranged family, and the haunting memories of cases that had gone sideways. Walker didn't just kill to cover up the past. He killed to bury the part of himself that knew he had crossed a line he couldn't return from. Leo had once thought of him as a ruthless cop, a man who cared only about himself, but now Leo understood the layers of his cruelty. Walker wasn't just a villain. He was a man drowning in his own demons, doing what he thought was necessary to stay afloat. He didn't feel guilt, he felt fear. Fear that his own sins would eventually catch up with him. Harris, too, was a woman trapped in her own contradictions. She had chosen her path long ago, justifying every compromise with the belief that the end always justified the means. But now, as she watched Leo's investigation unfold, she was forced to confront a truth she had been avoiding for years. The lines between right and wrong had blurred for her so many times that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Her actions had been motivated by a desire for power, for control, and the thought that she was doing what was necessary to keep the peace. But she had built her empire on the suffering of others, and now, as Leo's presence loomed larger, she couldn't shake the fear that the consequences were finally catching up to her. And Hill, with his rigid sense of discipline and order, had long ago crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had seen the corruption around him and chosen to turn a blind eye, believing that his role in the system allowed him to be above the consequences. But even Hill was starting to crack under the weight of his own conscience. He was a man desperate to hold on to the illusion of control, a man who had convinced himself that keeping his head down and playing the game was the only way to survive. But as Leo closed in on him, Hill's sense of invulnerability began to crumble. He was just as trapped as the others, only he had learned to wear a better mask. Leo's pursuit of justice, or vengeance, was becoming more complex. The more he learned about the antagonists in his life, the more he realized that they were not mere villains to be vanquished. They were men and women caught in the same web of corruption they had woven around others. They had made choices that led them to where they were now, but they were still human, still vulnerable in their own ways. They weren't purely evil, nor were they innocent. They were the product of a broken system. A system that had taught them that survival was the ultimate goal, no matter the cost. Leo couldn't help but feel conflicted. As much as they had destroyed his life, he couldn't deny that they were just as much victims of the system as he had become. They had fallen into the trap of self-preservation, just as he had fallen into the trap of revenge. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew there could be no forgiveness. They had taken Maria from him. They had taken his peace, his sense of security. And now, they would pay. Whether or not they were worthy of redemption didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was that he had a debt to settle. The moment Leo decided to take control of his destiny was a slow burn, like a spark waiting for the right kind of fuel. The anger had always been there, simmering just beneath the surface. But it was no longer enough to simply be angry. He needed to act, needed to make the world that had taken Maria from him feel the consequences of their actions. But the closer he came to this decision, the heavier the weight became. Every step he took toward vengeance felt like a step further, away from the man he had once been, a man who believed in justice, a man who had fought for the law. Now he was just a man consumed by the need for revenge. The thought of Maria's face haunted him constantly. Her smile, her voice, the way she had looked at him the last time they had spoken. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe, but in the end, he had failed. That failure had been eating him alive, slowly stripping away whatever resolve he had left. And yet in that failure, Something else had been born, an undeniable need to make them pay. At first, Leo had resisted the call to action. He'd told himself that he wasn't like them, that he wasn't like Walker or Harris or Hill. He had a sense of honor, a moral compass that told him revenge wasn't the answer. But in the quiet moments, in the dark of the night when he was alone with his thoughts, that moral compass had begun to waver. How could he fight the very system that had taken everything from him? How could he live with the fact that the people who had killed his wife were walking free, their power and influence keeping them above the law? The tipping point had come late one night, just a few days after he had begun his investigation. Leo had spent the entire evening tracking leads, poring over files, and reaching out to people who had known Maria. It was a futile exercise, one that only led to more questions and dead ends. And that night, as he sat in his car, staring out over the city that had once felt like home, something in him snapped. It was a phone call, a call that came at the wrong time, from the wrong person. The voice on the other end was one he didn't recognize at first, but the message was clear. You need to stop. This isn't the path you want to go down, Leo. It was a voice tinged with warning, fear even, but there was an underlying threat that Leo couldn't ignore. The person didn't identify themselves, but it didn't matter. The message was meant for him, and the tone made it clear that it was someone connected to the very system he was up against. Leo hung up the phone, his hands shaking, but his resolve hardened. He knew they were watching him. He knew they were aware of his investigation, aware that he was getting closer to uncovering the truth. The call was meant to intimidate him, to make him second-guess his pursuit of justice. But instead, it did the opposite. It lit a fire inside him, a fire that could no longer be extinguished. He needed to act. He needed to make them understand the cost of their actions. The moral hesitation, the self-doubt that had kept him stagnant for days, was no longer enough to stop him. It had become clear. The system wouldn't change itself. It wouldn't right the wrongs that had been done. Leo would have to do it himself. The first steps toward vengeance were deliberate, methodical, as he pieced together what he had learned. He studied the routines of the cops involved, their weaknesses, their habits. He didn't want to simply lash out in blind rage. He was smarter than that. He was a detective, after all. It wasn't enough to just hurt them. He wanted to make them feel what he felt: helpless, powerless, as though the world had turned its back on them, just as it had turned its back on him. But there was a cost. He felt it every time he considered what he was about to do. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, like an invisible chain wrapped tightly around his chest. He had once believed in the law, in the idea that justice could be found through the right channels. But now he saw the truth for what it was. Justice was a lie. The system was broken beyond repair, and the only way to fix it was to tear it down. Leo found himself pacing in the apartment late into the night, the cold light of the moon casting long shadows on the walls. He could feel the weight of his choices settling in on him. Every action, every decision, would change who he was, who he had been. The thought of walking away was tempting. He could stop now, pretend he had never gone down this path, tell himself that Maria wouldn't want him to do this. But deep down, he knew that the only thing that could stop him now was his own death. And he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. His mind kept returning to the same question. What would Maria want? The question echoed in his mind like a mantra, and yet it brought no clarity. Would she want him to avenge her death, to make those responsible feel the full weight of her loss? Or would she want him to walk away, to rebuild his life, to honor her memory by living the life they had once dreamed of? But he knew, in the deepest parts of his soul, that Maria wouldn't want him to be consumed by this. She had always been the one to remind him to keep his heart light, to live with kindness. But the world had taken that from him. And now, in the cold silence of the night, as the memories of her faded like a distant echo, he understood the truth. She would want him to fight, to take back what had been stolen from him. And yet, even as he made the decision to take action, the finality of it weighed heavily on him. The man he had been, the husband, the father, the protector he was losing, all of it. It was becoming something darker, something more dangerous, and there would be no going back. The next morning, Leo began making calls. He reached out to a network of contacts, people who knew how to move through the shadows of the city. A few favors here, a few bribes there. He didn't care about the cost anymore. He was beyond that. The first thing he needed was information, dirt on Walker, Harris, Hill, any weakness, any way in. He knew that if he was going to succeed, he had to make them feel like they were under siege, like they had no control over their lives. Leo was careful, meticulous. He took his time, gathering intelligence, but he never let himself be seen. His every move was calculated, every interaction a step in his plan. The only thing that mattered now was the endgame. He would not stop until they were brought to their knees. As he sat in his car, watching Walker leave his apartment building, Leo finally felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. The quiet buzz of the city around him, the constant hum of life, had never felt so distant. It was as though he was standing on the edge of something, a precipice where there would be no return. But for the first time in days, the weight of his guilt lifted, replaced by a cold clarity. He would make them pay. Leo's path was set. He had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. He had chosen vengeance over justice, the darkness over the light. The decisions he made from here on out would define him, would shape the man he would become. And as much as it terrified him, as much as the doubts continued to claw at him, he knew there was no turning back. The moment he took control of his destiny, he had sealed his own fate. The wheels of revenge were already in motion. He had taken the first step. Now there was no turning back. Leo had crossed the point of no return. His investigation into the corrupt officers who had taken Maria's life had consumed him, turning every waking moment into a series of calculated moves. He had isolated himself, relying only on his network of contacts and the few who would still speak to him. The rest of the world, it seemed, had shut him out. It was as if the system, the very thing he had once sworn to protect, had turned its back on him. But as Leo dug deeper, as he began to peel back the layers of lies and corruption that hid behind the badges, he found himself not just facing resistance from the men who had killed his wife, but from the system itself. Every lead he followed seemed to lead him into a dead end. Every attempt to expose the truth was met with more obstacles. He had thought the fight would be a straightforward one, a battle between right and wrong. But now, it was clear that the line between the two was far more blurred than he had ever imagined. The first sign that things were spiraling out of control came when Leo's trusted ally, Detective Sam Porter, suddenly backed away. Sam had been his partner for years, a man who had shared his values and believed in the pursuit of justice above all else. But as Leo pressed further into the corruption, Sam began to distance himself. At first it was subtle missed meetings, late-night phone calls that went unanswered, but soon, Leo began to sense that something was terribly wrong. One evening, Leo had arranged to meet Sam in a quiet bar on the outskirts of the city. The place was dimly lit, with the faint hum of jazz music playing in the background. Leo sat at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey, waiting for his friend to show up. He had already gathered enough evidence to expose the corruption within the department. He had proof that Walker, Harris, and Hill were all involved in the web of deceit that had led to Maria's death. But he knew that Sam was the key. If Sam stood by him, if Sam was willing to testify, then they could bring the entire system to its knees. When Sam finally walked in, Leo stood up, his heart racing. The moment their eyes met, Leo knew something was wrong. Sam's usual warm smile was absent, replaced by a cold, guarded expression. There was an unease in his posture, as though he was walking into enemy territory. "Sam," Leo said, trying to mask the tension in his voice. "You're late." Sam didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he lingered near the entrance, his gaze flickering nervously to the door. Leo noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he shifted uncomfortably, as if he was expecting someone to walk in. "At any moment, I didn't think it was a good idea to meet here." "Leo," Sam said quietly, his voice tight. "This place isn't safe." Leo frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? This is the only place I trust right now. We can't meet at the precinct. You know that." "I know," Sam muttered, still standing, "but you don't get it. There's too much heat on you. You're making a mistake, Leo. You're going after people who can ruin you. The department doesn't care about right or wrong. They'll bury you before you even get started." Leo felt the chill of realization crawl up his spine. "You're saying you won't help me? You've known about Walker and Harris for years. You've seen the corruption. We can expose it." Sam's eyes flickered with guilt. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "It's not that simple. I've seen it too, Leo. Hell, I've been part of it. But there's no winning this fight. The system is too big. It's bigger than us. They'll destroy you, and they'll destroy me too if I help you." Leo's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this. Sam wasn't just backing away, he was warning him to stop, to give up before it was too late. "You're not even going to try. You're just going to let them get away with it." Sam hesitated, looking torn, but the words that came out of his mouth were firm. "I can't be a part of this anymore, Leo. I'm sorry. I have a family. I've got to look out for them." The betrayal cut deeper than Leo had imagined. He had always trusted Sam, believed in him, and now, The man he had considered his closest ally was telling him to abandon his quest for justice. Sam wasn't just warning him, he was trying to save his own skin. Leo felt the weight of his frustration rise within him. He wanted to scream, to lash out at Sam, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, feeling the sting of betrayal settle in his bones. "You're making a mistake, Sam," Leo said, his voice low but filled with quiet anger. "You're letting them win." Sam's expression softened, but it was clear that his decision had been made. "I know, but I'm doing what I have to do." Leo watched as Sam turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving Leo standing there with nothing but the remnants of a broken trust. The next obstacle came in the form of Captain Hill. Leo had hoped that Hill, with his position of power within the department, would be the one to finally break the silence, to turn against the men who had killed Maria. But as Leo began to dig into Hill's past, he uncovered something far more unsettling than he had anticipated. Hill had always been a figure of authority, a man who seemed to represent everything Leo had once believed in. He was disciplined, professional, and unwavering in his commitment to the at least. That was the image he had projected. But as Leo uncovered more, he began to see the cracks in Hill's facade. Hill had made deals with criminals. He had taken bribes, protected gang leaders, and turned a blind eye to the more sinister dealings that kept the system running smoothly. Leo knew that Hill wasn't just complicit in Maria's death, he was at the heart of the corruption that had rotted the department from the inside out. But exposing Hill would be the hardest part. Hill had power, connections, and a network of loyal officers who would do anything to protect him. If Leo went after Hill, he knew there would be no going back. It would be war not just with the department, but with the entire system. The final blow came when Leo received an anonymous tip that the very files he had been collecting, files that contained irrefutable evidence of the corruption within the department, had gone missing. The tip led him to a dead-drop location on the outskirts of the city, a place he had never been before. His heart raced as he approached the location, hoping against hope that the tip was a mistake, that his evidence was still intact. But when he arrived, there was nothing. No files, no clues, just the feeling of being watched, of knowing that he was too late. It was as if someone, somewhere, had anticipated his every move, had known exactly what he would do, and in that moment, Leo understood the full extent of the system's power. It wasn't just the officers who were corrupt, it was everyone. The system had eyes everywhere. It was all connected, and every attempt Leo made to expose it only brought him deeper into its grip. His hands trembled as he stood in the empty lot, staring at the spot where his evidence had been, knowing that the game had changed. The resistance wasn't just coming from Walker, Harris, and Hill. It was coming from the very structure he had spent his career working to protect. The system had turned against him, and now, it seemed as though he was fighting a battle he could never win. The toll of the resistance began to wear on Leo. He couldn't trust anyone. His friends had turned on him, the people who had once shared his values now siding with the very system they had sworn to expose. He had no one left but himself and the burning need for vengeance. He spent his nights alone, pacing through his apartment, struggling with the weight of the choices he had made. The quest for justice had consumed him, had turned him into someone he barely recognized. His morals, once so clear, now seemed so distant, as though they belonged to someone else. The fight had taken everything from him: his integrity, his sense of self, his belief in the system he had spent his life serving. In the quiet moments, Leo began to question whether it had been worth it. He had spent every ounce of his energy trying to bring the corrupt officers to justice, but at what cost? His mind, his soul, his very identity had been eroded by the pursuit of vengeance. There was nothing left of the man he had once been. And yet, even as his own spirit faltered, the fire of revenge still burned brightly within him. The system had resisted, had tried to tear him down, but Leo refused to back down. He had nothing left to lose. The people who had killed Maria were still out there, still free, and they would pay, no matter the cost. The city felt colder now, as if it too had begun to turn its back on him. Leo stood at the edge of the shadows, watching the flickering streetlights cast long, twisted reflections on the asphalt. The world around him seemed distant, muted by the deafening roar of his own heart, which beat wildly in his chest. This moment, the moment he had been building towards for so long, had arrived. The weight of it hung in the air, thick with anticipation, desperation, and a sense of inevitability. He had spent months, maybe longer, chasing the ghosts of his past, the men who had killed Maria, the men who had corrupted the system he had sworn to uphold, and now, the final confrontation loomed before him. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about revenge. It was about making them feel the same pain that had consumed him every waking moment since Maria's death. Leo had everything he needed: proof, names, connections, but it no longer mattered. He had crossed too many lines, made too many compromises. He wasn't the man he had been when he started. He had become something darker, something that was no longer just seeking justice, but instead seeking retribution. The truth was he had lost himself in the pursuit. There was no going back now. That as he approached the abandoned warehouse, the place where it would all end, his mind raced through the steps, the strategy he had carefully laid out. He knew Walker, Harris, and Hill would be there waiting for him. They had known he was coming. They always knew. They had been watching him, anticipating his every move just as he had been watching them. It was a chess game now, one where Leo had long since stopped playing by the rules. The cold wind bit at his skin as he pulled the collar of his jacket up higher. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back, to walk away, to just let it all go. But the anger that had driven him here was too powerful, too consuming. It had taken root deep in his soul, twisted him, and now there was nothing left but this final, inevitable confrontation. Inside the warehouse, the low hum of fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sickly glow on the cement floor. Leo's footsteps echoed, sharp and rhythmic, as he moved deeper into the heart of the darkness. His gun was gripped tightly in his hand, but it felt foreign in his grasp, as though it belonged to someone else. The steady, purposeful clink of his boots was the only sound in the otherwise silent space. He had no idea if they were watching him now, but he could feel their presence faint, like a shadow on his skin. And then, he saw them. Walker stood in the far corner, his arms crossed over his chest, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face, as if everything was already settled in his mind. Harris, sharp and calculating, leaned against a pillar, her eyes narrowing as she studied Leo. Hill, the ever-present captain, was there too, sitting in a chair by a desk, his face grim, but his posture confident. They were the puppeteers, the ones who had pulled the strings, the ones who had hidden in plain sight. And now, finally, they would pay. "You've come a long way, Leo." Walker's voice was smooth, taunting. "Did you really think you could expose us, bring us down? You're just a pawn in a game you'll never understand." Leo's hand tightened around the gun. "I'm not here for your games, Walker. I'm here for Maria. I'm here to make you pay." Harris stepped forward, her sharp eyes studying him. "You don't get it, do you? You've already lost. We've been playing this game far longer than you. You think you can take us down? We own everything. The city, the courts, the police. You're just one man, and no one cares about your crusade." Leo's pulse thudded in his temples, the tension in the room mounting with every word, but his grip remained steady. He had come too far to back down now. "You killed her." Leo's voice cracked, the raw grief pouring through him. "You murdered Maria in cold blood. And you think I'm going to let you walk away from this?" Hill, who had been quiet until now, stood slowly. He was a large man, imposing, his presence commanding attention. "You don't get to judge us," Leo Hill said, his voice carrying a heavy authority. "We did what we had to do to survive. You think you're the only one who's suffered. You think you're the only one who's had to make hard choices. You don't understand what it means to truly be in control." Leo's mind reeled, and for a moment he found himself standing in the center of it all, a pawn in their game, just as Walker had said. Was he any different from them? Wasn't he, too, using his power to destroy those who stood in his way? Wasn't this just another form of the same cruelty he had once fought against? He had crossed every line, discarded every moral boundary, all in the name of revenge. For the first time, Leo felt the weight of that realization, the crushing truth that he had become like them, the very thing he had sworn to defeat. His hand shook slightly, and for a fleeting second, he wondered if this was really what Maria would have wanted. Had he lost his soul in the process? The silence stretched on, thick with the tension of unspoken truths. And then, just as Leo's doubts began to pull him under, the moment shifted. Walker lunged forward, knocking the gun from Leo's hand with a swift, practiced move. Harris was at his side, her eyes gleaming with a mix of contempt and satisfaction. "You should have stayed in your lane, Leo," she hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Now you're nothing, just a pathetic man clinging to a dead woman's memory." Leo's chest constricted. He had lost. They were right. He was nothing but a broken man, trying to make the world feel his pain. His heart raced as his vision blurred, his mind swirling in a vortex of confusion and rage. But as Walker grinned, standing over him, Leo's rage flared. This wasn't about what he had become. This was about what they had done to Maria. In that instant, He realized he wasn't fighting for his own redemption, he was fighting for her. He surged forward, using every ounce of strength left in his body to shove Walker back, causing the man to stumble, falling into a stack of crates. He wasn't thinking anymore. He wasn't trying to play by the rules. His emotions had become a weapon, raw, untamed, and ruthless. He was no longer Leo the detective, the man who once fought for justice. He was Leo the avenger, the man who had been pushed too far. Harris was on him now, trying to subdue him, but Leo shoved her off with a force that surprised even him. She landed hard against the floor, gasping for air. Hill tried to intervene, but Leo was faster. He grabbed a metal pipe from the floor, swinging it with all the power of his fury. The world around him had become a blur of action, of violence. The warehouse felt like it was closing in on him, its walls pressing inward as he fought with everything he had. His fists landed on Walker, on Hill, on the faces of the men who had destroyed everything he loved. But with each blow, he felt more distant, more disconnected from the person he had once been. Finally, with a scream of rage, Leo pinned Walker to the ground, his fist raised high. In that moment, it wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, pure and simple. He could feel his own heartbeat in his ears, the heat of his rage coursing through his veins. But as his fist hovered above Walker's face, the weight of the moment came crashing down on him. His breath was ragged, his body aching from the violence. And as he stared at the man beneath him, the man who had stolen Maria's life, Leo realized the truth. There was no redemption for him now. He had crossed a line he couldn't return. A voice broke through the haze of his thoughts, a quiet voice, familiar, almost like a memory. "Is this really what you want, Leo?" It was Maria's voice, echoing in his mind. She had always been his anchor, his guiding star, and now, in the darkest moment of his life, her memory called out to him. Her voice was a reminder of the man he had once been, the man who believed in justice, in right and wrong. Leo's hand trembled, the pipe falling from his grip. He collapsed to his knees, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The anger, the grief, the desire for vengeance of it had led him here, to this moment of reckoning. And now, in the face of the very men who had destroyed his world, Leo understood the cost of what he had done. In his pursuit of justice, he had become the very thing he had sworn to fight against. The room fell silent as Leo stared at the men. Beneath him they had been brought low, but so had he. The fight was over. The consequences had caught up with him, and in that moment, Leo was forced to make a choice. Would he expose the truth, knowing that doing so would destroy everything he had left, or would he maintain his silence, knowing that the blood on his hands would never be washed away? As he looked at Walker, Hill, and Harris, he realized there was only one truth left. The fight was no longer just about revenge. It was about what kind of man he would be when the dust settled. And as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of the warehouse, Leo made his decision. The truth would stay buried, and so would he. The morning after the fight, Leo stood at the edge of the warehouse, watching the city wake up. The first rays of sunlight bathed the streets in an orange hue, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the pavement like ghosts. The air was thick with the hum of life cars rushing by, people bustling down sidewalks, the mundane activities of a city that had no idea what had transpired the night before. No one knew that the men who had orchestrated his wife's murder were lying in a heap in the warehouse behind him, broken and defeated, but alive. He wasn't sure what had happened in those final moments. His body was bruised, his mind fractured. Had he really come that close to killing them? Had he almost destroyed everything, what little of himself was left in his quest for vengeance? The ache in his chest wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something more insidious. He had done it, he had confronted them, exposed them for the monsters they were, but at what cost? What had he really achieved? Leo looked down, at his hands, the same hands that had fought for justice, that had held Maria's hand in the quiet moments of their life, now stained with blood both metaphorically and, in some ways, literally. He felt the weight of his choices pressing on him, crushing him from all sides. Justice had been served, in a way. Walker, Harris, and Hill were no longer in control. Their power, their grip on the city, was fractured. They would be brought down, and the corruption that had allowed them to thrive would slowly begin to unravel. In time, the system might even be cleaned, but at what cost? He had sacrificed his own morality, his own sense of self, in the process. He had become something else, something darker. Leo had made the choice to maintain his silence, to protect himself and the few shreds of humanity he had left. But the aftermath of that decision felt more like a hollow victory than a triumph. The men who had murdered Maria would face the consequences of their actions, They would be brought to trial, exposed for what they had done. But Leo knew that there was no real justice to be found in a courtroom. Not for him, not for Maria, had believed that taking action would give him closure. That if he made them pay, if he tore down the system that had allowed them to flourish, he would somehow find peace. But peace was elusive. It slipped through his fingers like sand. The truth was, even if the world learned what had happened, even if the police force was shaken to its core, it would never bring Maria back. It would never heal the deep wound in his heart. Everywhere he went, he saw her face. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world quieted down, her smile haunted him, her laughter echoing in his mind. He couldn't escape her. He couldn't escape the loss. A week had passed since the warehouse. Leo had avoided contact with everyone, his colleagues, his friends, his family. He didn't have the strength to face them. There was no one left who could understand the weight of what he had done, no one who could look at him without seeing the monster he had become. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. It was late afternoon when he returned home. The house was quiet, too quiet. The air felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath. Maria's presence still lingered here, in the corners of the rooms, in the clothes she had left behind. It was as if the house itself had become a monument to her memory. Everything about it reminded him of the life they had shared, the future they had planned. But that life was gone now, and all that remained were the shattered fragments of what could have been. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom, staring at the bed where they had once shared peaceful nights. It felt like a lifetime ago, a different world entirely. His fingers brushed the edge of the nightstand, where Maria's favorite book had sat untouched, still waiting for her to pick it up again. The pain of loss hit him like a physical blow, and he sank down onto the bed, burying his face in his hands. The quiet was unbearable. Leo thought about the fight, about the faces of Walker, Harris, and Hill. He thought about the darkness he had embraced to destroy them. He had become everything he had once hated. He had used the very methods of the corrupt to bring down the system. He had killed part of himself in the process. The rage that had once burned so fiercely within him had turned to ash, and now all that was left was the void. The weight of his choices suffocated him. He could have stopped. He could have walked away from the edge, but he hadn't. Instead, he had let vengeance consume him. And now, even as he had exacted some measure of justice, there was nothing left. The justice he had fought for wasn't justice at all. It was just a means to an end that had destroyed him as much as it had brought down those who had killed Maria. Weeks passed, and Leo drifted further into isolation. The city moved on. The case against Walker, Harris, and Hill moved forward. But the world continued to turn, indifferent to his suffering. The trial, when it came, was public. The media coverage sensationalized. The very system he had fought to expose had turned his quest into a spectacle, a story of vengeance and corruption, one more headline in the endless churn of the news cycle. In the end, the world was satisfied that justice had been served. But Leo knew better. He knew the truth, and the truth now was just another painful reminder of what he had lost. Every day he woke up, but he didn't live. His routine had become a hollow shell of what it once was. He went to work, clocked in, clocked out, but he was a ghost, walking through life with the weight of his decisions dragging him down. He had buried himself in the pursuit of vengeance, and now he couldn't escape the emptiness that remained. The pain of losing Maria had become a dull ache, always present but no longer raw. It was like a scar that had formed on his soul, a constant reminder of the cost of his choices. He had gotten what he wanted. Walker, Harris, and Hill were imprisoned. The truth had been exposed, and the city had begun to heal. But Leo hadn't healed. The victory felt hollow, like a glass trophy that had cracked under the weight of time. In the quiet hours of the night, Leo would often sit by the window, staring out at the city below, feeling the weight of his decisions. Pressing in on him, he had won, yes. But at what cost? He had become a part of the corruption he had fought against. He had embraced the darkness, and now there was no light left to guide him back. The story of his life, of Maria's life, had been rewritten. The justice they had fought for had come, but it had come at a price far greater than Leo had ever anticipated. And now, as he sat alone in the dark, he could only wonder if it had all been worth it. The final blow came when he received a letter from Lucas. It was short, filled with the innocence of a child, asking why his father wasn't around anymore, why he didn't come home, why he didn't smile anymore. The weight of those words, written by a boy who didn't fully understand the world, crushed Leo completely. He had turned his back on everything for the sake of vengeance, and now he was losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him, his son. Lucas had become the last thread that tied Leo to whatever humanity remained within him, and yet, Even as he reached out to him, Leo knew he could never go back. The man who had gone after vengeance was gone. He had destroyed that part of himself in the pursuit of justice. Leo had achieved what he set out to do: justice, revenge, retribution, but it had come at the cost of his own soul. He had lost Maria, lost his own sense of purpose, and now he was losing his son. And as the letter fluttered in his hand, Leo sat back in the chair and wept, knowing that the victory he had fought for had come with a price far greater than anything he could have imagined. There was no solace, no redemption, only a man who had been consumed by his own rage, left with nothing but the ashes of a life he could never get back. The story was over, but for Leo, the consequences of his choices would haunt him forever.